up, everybody? Welcome to a delayed. Well, that's weak. Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Let's Ask Paul. My name is Paul Abernathy, your host as always, and welcome to the podcast where we answer your electrical code questions. Anything electrical in nature that you want to send, we're more than happy to answer them, or at least give it a good old shot at answering those. But if you have those questions and you want to submit them, do me a favor. All you've got to do is go over to paulabernathy.com, and there you can submit your questions directly through our Q&A portal. Now, your questions, again, go into a queue, and I get them as I can get to them, and it may be in an email, or it could be in an upcoming episode podcast like the one we're going to do today, where I answer various questions that you submit through that portal. Okay, so if you want to do that, check that out. Real quick, we're going to have a promotional plug. If you're interested in learning the National Electrical Code or anything about the National Electrical Code in more depth, then check out our Fast Tracks program. That's the Fast Tracks Black program. If you want to learn the 30,000-foot view of the National Electrical Code for exam preparation, or just want your folks in your team to become more code savvy, then that's the program that you're going to use. So check that out over on our website, electricalcodeacademy.com, .net, .org, doesn't matter. But you can also go to fasttrackssystem.com. That's FASTTRAXSYSTEM.com. And it'll take you right to that page, and you can watch that demo video. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. We're more than happy to answer those questions for you. All right, so let's get into today's question that was submitted. And again, I remind you that anybody can submit questions. We don't really care who it is. If you want to create a fake email address and use a anonymous name or whatever because you're worried about who you are submitting a question, don't worry. Just submit your question. I'm more than happy to answer any questions from anybody on any topic. All right. Again, we do take them at the order that they come in. I do get quite a bit of questions, so just be patient with us, and your question will either be answered again in an email or on a podcast. All right, so let's get into the first question for today. And I will remind you, I kind of just looked at this question right before we started this, and I'm going to also use this as an opportunity to explain some things while we're in the middle of this. And I'll remind you that you always have the right to disagree. That's your right. You have a right to an opinion. Don't get your butt hurt. If you think that I'm wrong, that's okay. There you go. That's your opinion. And you can roll with it. Doesn't mean you have to be shitty to me. That's up to you. So I'm going to give you my interpretation and my view, and you can have yours, and that's perfectly fine. I don't have a problem with it. I'll eagerly await your podcast where you can give your opinions publicly if you like to put yourself out there. Most people do not. So again, know your role, and let's move on. All right, first it says, "Hello, Paul. First off, I want to say thank you for all you do. I stumbled upon your podcast back in 2005 as an apprentice when you were in Virginia, but you had to discontinue due to some conflict of interest, and at that point, I thought it was over until about 2 years ago. There was never a conflict of interest. Back in the day, people remember, yes, this is validation for anybody out there that says, no way, Paul, you weren't doing these all the way back in 2005 and 2004 like you claim. Yes, I was doing it. And this just validates it, okay? So those out there that said all kinds of crap. So back in the day, we used something called 1,000 mics, and it was very bulky. And it was a way to get it online so people could listen to it through a player. So it was less clunky. Because otherwise I was uploading things via AOL, and it was, you remember all that dial-up mess from AOL, that bleep, 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 bleep. Yeah, it was a mess. There was no high speed. And these files were large. It wasn't compressed like today. And dude, it was just a lot of work. And we used to upload all of them, and people could listen to them. But what happened is we found a better method for delivery, and so we moved away from the 1,000 mics, and eventually they went out of business. But you probably didn't follow us as I moved over to a different platform, which we had our own website, and at that point we just posted them on the website for you to listen to. So that's probably what happened. But what we are glad is that you reconnected with us many years later. Looks like over almost 20 years later or something to that effect. 15 years later, whatever it would be. So again, we appreciate you migrating over and getting back into the swing. It says, I have since earned both my journeyman and contractor's license, and you had a big part of that. Thank you so much. Thank you again so much. Well, again, it's always an honor for me to know that I help other people out there. That's kind of what my mission is. Yes, I got to charge for courses. Yes, I got to make a living. But there's nothing wrong with bringing, getting the joy out of seeing people be successful and achieving their dreams. And in this case, somebody becomes a journeyman and then they move on to be a contractor. And it means a lot. It's totally something that I look forward to hearing from all of the people that I've touched. So if I've ever touched you in any way, any of my podcasts or anything has helped you, and I love hearing those things. It does. I do live vicariously through people that have learned from my stuff over the years. And I've obviously been doing it for quite a few years. And of course, I got my haters too, but that's all good. They won't admit they actually get something out of it, but that's okay. Don't want to have their butt hurt. All right, so let's go on. It says, now for my question. We do a lot of service upgrades and revamps. We recently came across a 200 amp service panel with a distribution. Okay, so I'm assuming 200 amp main breaker, and it has breakers in it that's feeding remote distribution panels, okay? On the load side of this panel, there were 3 2-pole breakers, 2 70 amp breakers, and 1 60 amp breaker. The feeders for each one of those were sized at 100 amperes to 3 separate remote distribution panels rated at 125 amps each. Okay, he says, which made sense. Okay, so in that scenario, what we're assuming is that, again, in this panel, you have multiple breakers, and if you start adding them all up, people would get concerned, right? They would think, okay, 70 plus 70 plus 60 is 200. Knowing that there's probably other branch breakers in there, okay, 20 amps or 15s or whatnot like that, we don't size the service based on just typically adding up the devices in there, okay? It's all based on a load calculation. Part 3 or Part 4 of Article 220, it assumes that we do some load calcs here. We have to assume that. Now, the reality is people don't, but they just pick a large one and just go with it. But we have to assume that's what's taking place, right? So he feels very comfortable with this. So that means that the 2 70 amp breakers and the 1 60 amp breakers, they have feeders that are rated for 100 amperes, and they're terminating it in a 125 amp panel. That's perfectly fine. You can have a panel rating which exceeds the rating that you're using as the protection for that panel. That's fine. You're still protecting that panel at less than what the rating is of the enclosure. That's fine. So, and it's very common to have a 100 amp panel that actually has a rating of 125. So again, you have to look at your panels, look at whatever the label says and whatnot on it. But here, I have no problem. There's no problem at all with the 70 amp breaker with a feeder that's rated for 100 amperes feeding a 125 amp panel. That's no problem at all. The one thing that has to be considered is that, and we'll assume here that the 70 amp breaker has been sized, and this is a feeder, so it's been sized based on 215, and 215.3 gives us overcurrent protection rules. Again, sized at 125% of continuous loads, 100% of non-continuous loads. We'll assume that the feeder itself has been sized based on 215.2A1, whether it's A1A or A1B, considering the conditions of use, or if it's continuous and non-continuous loads. However, we'll assume that's been sized properly for that, so it corresponds with the device and everything's fine, right? So everything is good to go, okay? And everybody's done that, okay? All right, so assuming all that has been done, whether there is continuous or non-continuous or whatever it may be, yes, I can have a larger conductor terminating on a breaker that feeds a panel. That panel, whether it has a rating of 125 or not, is still going to be protected at the 70 amps or the 60 amps or whatever those breakers are that are at the feeder. So it's going to be overcurrent protection, short circuit, and ground fault protection at that rating. Okay? So it's not going to be something that the panel downstream is going to exceed. Even though the panel is rated 125, and if there was a main breaker in there for 125, it's really only serving as a disconnect at this point. Okay? It's protected upstream to the feeders. Okay? So that's why he says no problem with it, and there's no problem with that. See it all the time. So then he goes on to say, the next day we came across a 125 amp service panel with distribution, and the load side of this panel were two-pole 100 amp breakers with properly sized feeder cables to two separate 100 amp rated distribution panels. Is the 125 amp service panel overloaded? Okay, and we'll answer this, but let me read the rest of the question, just get it out of the way. This was already there and when we arrived, so it had to pass an inspection at some time before. Please explain where in the code book this is allowed. Thank you very much. All right, so the premise here is that we have to look at the breakdown of what we're trying to do here. It's very common for us to have a panel where the breakers itself will exceed the rating of whatever the main breaker is of the panel. We see this all the time, right? This is a common thing we see and perfectly fine, acceptable practice. What we have to remember is that the feeder breaker is protecting the feeder. And so that's the key. It assumes that we've done a load calculation at whatever these remote distribution panels are. We've done the load. We know what the loads are. Obviously, if we had a 200 amp service and our load calculation only was 60 amps, we choose to do a 200 amp service. That's fine. The extra capacity's there, and but again, we're dealing with today, not tomorrow. Sadly, that's somebody else's responsibility in this situation. So if the 100 amp breakers that are in there, you still have that 125 amp main, and you have these two 100s. Ultimately, you got to remember that breaker in the main panel is there to protect that bus, right? And so even if I have the two 100 amps in there, the conductors are sized. You're protecting the conductors because he says they're sized properly. They're protected at 100 amps, or they have a rating for 100 amps, or at least can handle that. And then, of course, you have the breaker that's going to protect those conductors. That's what it's for. And then in those remote distribution panels, you have your different loads, and you're going to have branch circuit overcurrent protection, and it's going to be sized to protect those loads. It assumes that you've done all these load calculations, but at the end of the day, if there is an excessive amount of load on each one of these 100 amp remote distribution panels, you're going to have a main breaker trip over in the main panel. So that 125 will trip. There's no evidence that that's taken place in what you said. So, I don't really have any problem with it. Others might, but I don't have any problem with it at this time. We're going to assume that the load calculation, again, is so diverse that it's not causing a problem. In the real world, I probably would look at my load and I would have, sized accordingly. And you can always have a larger remote distribution panel. I can have a 125. I can even have a 200 amp and be fed with the 70 amp or 60 amp or 100 amp. That's perfectly fine as long as the conductors I'm choosing that are supplying that remote distribution panel is actually protected at its ampacity. Remembering again that feeders have to be sized based on 125% of a continuous load and 100% of a non-continuous load, and assuming that you've done all that and you've figured that all in when you did your load calculations under Part 3 or Part 4 of Article 220. All right, so again, I don't have any general problem with that. As far as giving you code references, I can only tell you that it assumes that the conductor sizing for this feeders are based on 215.3, and that's all been taken into consideration, that the actual feeder conductors are been calculated in accordance with 215.2 A1, and that's been taken into consideration, and that somebody has done a load calculation on that remote distribution panel, and the loads are going to be in there, and they're okay. Remembering that at the end of the day, the 125 amp main is going to trip if the overcurrent condition, or in this case, they're more concerned with the overload condition, exceeds 125 amps. So again, this is all based on the concept. I know it doesn't look right, doesn't feel right, but it's kind of a practice we've done a lot in the code. So just making sure that if you're going to put it on a 100 amp breaker, that your conductors are rated for 100 amperes, but you do have to understand that you're severely limiting the amounts of load that you can have because you got a main breaker that's going to limit it to 125 amps. Okay. The other thing I want you to consider is if you look in this panel, it probably has a rating that can't be exceeded. In other words, on the bus. So it might say something like, when you should look at it, it might say that a 100 amp panel, you can't have more than a 90 amp rated overcurrent device on the bus, like a 2-pole breaker. It's going to have it. So look in the literature, see what it says. If it says the maximum size of the overcurrent devices is 100 amps, then, putting 200 amp breakers in there wouldn't be a problem. Again, it's all about the load, all about the calculation, but the limiting factor, again, is going to be on that 125 amp main breaker, that if it sees more load being drawn than it's rated for, then it's going to trip. And you're going to have that reoccurring tripping, and somebody's going to know this. This is going to be a problem. Very rarely do we hear about main breakers tripping. I mean, believe it or not, we really don't. It's usually isolated to the individual overcurrent protected devices. Due to diversity, you have got the 100 amp remote distribution panel and you got the other one. Collectively, how much current are they drawing? And you really didn't say anything about what other overcurrent devices are in these panels. So we're only going to speculate at that concept, right? But again, it is very common for feeder panels, for example. In the 2020 code, we got rid of the 6 disconnect rule for services in a single cabinet, right? We got rid of that for services because of a safety condition. We still have that allowance for feeders because we have a breaker upstream that can disconnect the power. So we can have, it's very common to have multiple breakers in there that will exceed the rating of that breaker that's feeding it, okay? It's very common. But again, we have to do everything based on the calculated load, and that's the key. Key is all based on the calculated load, and it assumes that you have done such a calculation. In your case, it's passed, it has an inspection, it's running, there's no evidence of the main tripping, then there must be a good diversity of the loads. Now, are you coming in and you're going to be adding a bunch of circuits? Then you need to do load calculations to see whether or not you're going to have a problem where you just start adding a bunch of loads, and now the 125 back at the main panel starts tripping because of overload conditions. And then you're going to have to do a load calculation on each one of these separate panels to see what the load contribution is. Then you just created the problem that wasn't there, and you have to be aware of it. But there's nothing really in my mind you're going to have to do to this right now if that stays the way it is. It was passed. Again, people are not going to like the thought. People are going to say, yeah, but somebody could load this, and as long as the feeder's protected, as long as the overcurrent's protecting it, as long as the panel's being protected downstream, the remote distribution panel, ultimately, if it is overloaded, then it should trip back at the main if that bus is rated properly. And typically, a 100 amp rated panel, the bus is going to be a 125 because of remembering that we take continuous loads at 125% and non at 100%. And with the reciprocal of that is the 80%. So if you were to take that 125, right, and you were to do that times 0.80, that equals 100 amps. So, and then if you do it the other way, you do 100 times 1.25, that's 125. So that's kind of where it comes from. But just make sure that you also look at the listing of that bus that's in that main panel and see what the maximum rating of the overcurrent devices connected to that bus can be. Since it is a 100 amp panel, it's a good probability that it might be a rating that's less than 100. And of course, if that's the case, putting 200s in there would be a violation, right? Or putting 100 in there would be a violation. So go check that out. But again, it's been inspected. It's already there. It's been probably working for a while. Click an amp probe on it and see what those feeders are pulling. Due to diversity, it's probably pulling hardly nothing. I don't know how many times I've been to a 200 amp service and clicked an amp probe on it and told them, turn everything you think you'd run on. Just turn it all on. Lower your air conditioning down, have it come on or heat or whatever. And it's so common for me to see a 200 amp service with an actual amp draw of about 60 amps or 70 amps maximum, if that. The range running, air conditioning running, other loads. I mean, just diversity is just an amazing thing anyway. And this is why the optional method, and we're doing service and feeder calculations, always ends up being less than the standard method. Is again, it takes into a heavy diversification, and nobody would do the standard method unless you're taking an exam. Then you got to know how to do it. Other than that, nobody in their right mind would ever do that, right? Okay, hopefully that answers your question. Again, giving you code references that I can only tell you 215.3, 215.2, dealing with the feeder. That service of 125, you rate the service in Article 230 and 220 for the calculation based on the calculated load. So this is assuming that somebody did a load calculation and determined that the overall load was 125 was fine. If that's all based on a load calculation. So anything other than that, I'd be honest with you, I'd just be speculating, and I don't want to speculate on that. So that's the best I can give you for that. Hopefully that helps you out. If it doesn't, follow up with another email, give me a little more detail, and we'll do my best. And if you disagree with that out there, you say, nope, that's not right, you can't put 100th amp in there, well, you know more information about the question than I do, so that's the best I can give you. And we will move on to the next question. All right, so the next question we have submitted on today's episode of Ask Paul is, hey, Paul, appreciate your podcast. Been watching your videos and podcasts for years. You also went to a subscription-only model, which I immediately joined. The content in there is so valuable that you can't put a price on it. For $9.99 a month, it's just an amazing offer, and I love all the new content you're providing. Well, first of all, thank you. Appreciate that. Again, we work very hard to try to give you as much good content as we can. Again, I don't utilize YouTubes and stuff for the free content as much as I used to. Now, again, we have to pay the bills, so I appreciate that. I'd like to think that for $9.99 a month, you get your value. Also, we have the $120 a year, or $119 a year, and you'll get access to the Wednesday nights. You can get access to any webinars we do. You don't have to pay for them. If you have the app, you get access to all the exclusive videos that we put on the app as well. So again, we like to think it's very good value. He goes on to say, Paul, can you do me a favor and can you explain the circuit breaker ratings versus straight voltage versus slash voltage ratings in Article 240? Thanks in advance. Okay, great question. Does happen I'll get this question quite a bit when it comes to the application or voltage ratings of an overcurrent protective device. Okay, so what you're going to look at in the code, just so you know where to go, so everybody knows where we're dealing with here. And I'm in the 2020 edition of the NEC, and I don't believe that this has changed from a previous edition. And I don't believe this is changing in the 2023. This is talking about application of circuit breakers. So it's in Article 240, but we're under Section 85. 85 is applications, right? So I'm going to read it to you, and I do my best to explain it so you understand what it means and kind of give you a concept of what we're talking about here. Okay, it says under 240.85, it says applications, says a circuit breaker with a straight voltage rating such as a 240 or 480. Now that's just a circuit breaker that if you look at the side of it, it's not giving you any slash. It's not doing 120 slash 240. It's not doing 277 slash 480. It's just straight. It just gives you the voltage. Okay, and here's what it says: shall be permitted to be applied in a circuit in which the nominal voltage between any two conductors, okay, shall not exceed the circuit breaker's voltage rating. Okay, so in a three-phase, if I can't have, for example, A, B, and C. If it's a delta, let's say 120, 240, then what I've got is a maximum 240 between phases, or between the legs, however it makes you feel better, okay? So that is the maximum rating, and so I can't use one, for example, that has a maximum 240 volts, okay, between any two conductors, okay? I can't do that and use it on something that might be exceeding 240 volts between two ungrounded conductors, okay? So I can't use it on that scenario. So I have to be very careful where I'm selecting it, right? Now, that is a straight rating, and I'll go on and read more. It says, a two-pole circuit breaker shall not be used for protecting a three-phase corner-grounded delta circuit unless the circuit breaker is marked single-phase / three-phase to indicate such suitability, right? So it's basically saying a two-pole circuit breaker, which is typically going to be for a single-phase application, you're not going to be using that in a three-phase corner-grounded delta unless it's marked accordingly that says that it's okay for single-phase or three-phase. Otherwise, typical two-pole breakers like that would be rated for a single-phase application. So if you're looking in a situation and it just happens to be a three-phase corner-grounded delta circuit that you're trying to install this two-pole breaker on, you just need to look at the breaker and make sure that it has a marking single-phase / three-phase or dash three-phase to indicate its suitability for this application. Okay. Now we're not talking about a Y system. Okay. Again, you have the derived any one phase to phase. Again, that's an application where you could use a two-pole breaker. Not going to be a problem. But what we're looking for in a straight rating is that whatever we connected in, phase to phase, and we put it on a bus, we're wanting to make sure that we're not going to exceed the voltage rating between any two of those conductors that we're using that breaker on is not going to exceed the straight rating of that breaker. That's a 480 volt. It's not going to exceed 480. 240 volt ones, not going to exceed 240. We most certainly are not going to use a 240 on a 480. That's no brainer, right? Common sense. All right, so that's what that's kind of covering. So that's a straight rating. Now, it goes on to what's called a slash rating, which is probably what we see mainly when you see something that's going to have two different voltage classes listed on a breaker, a 122.08, a 122.40, 277.480, that type of thing. And here's what it says. It says a circuit breaker with a slash rating, such as a 122.40 volt or a 480 Y 277 volt, shall be permitted to be applied on a solidly grounded circuit where the nominal voltage of any conductor to ground does not exceed the lower value of the circuit breaker's voltage rating, and the nominal voltage between any two conductors does not exceed the higher value of the circuit breaker's voltage rating. Okay, so if I'm dealing in a 122.40 volt panel for just a residence, just the normal situation, and that means that when I can take a breaker that's rated 122.40 volts, the 120 to ground is that circuit that's making that connection to ground, which is a connection to a neutral, which is intentionally grounded in a grounded system. It's not going to exceed 120 volts, right? So what does that mean for us? And so phase to phase, it's not going to exceed 240 because that's the higher rating of the other side of the slash rating. Okay. Perfectly fine in a residence. This is not going to be an issue. Now, one of the things to be aware of is that many people will grab a 122.40 volt breaker and they might be in a situation where they're in 277.480. And you can't do that because the voltage to ground on the lower side of the slash rating on a 122.40 is 120. But the lower rating on a 277.480 is 277 to ground. So obviously that exceeds the lower value of the slash rating. So it's real important, especially with service people, when you're out and you just have some breakers on your truck and you're out there doing your thing. You just need to make sure that you are looking at your breaker before you make that selection, because it needs to make sure that it can work within a specific voltage class, right? So that's typically what. Now, any breaker that's designed to work with 120 volts, or it's probably going to be a slash rating. Okay? A 240 volt breaker is typically always going to be a two-pole breaker in that scenario. Okay? So it will have a 240 volt rating or 480 volt, and others can disagree with that, but that's typically what you're going to find if you go grab them and look at it. All right? Now, the majority of what we're probably going to see on service trucks is probably going to be slash ratings, right? That's typically what you're gonna see is the slash. Now there is an informational note here that says proper application of molded case circuit breakers on a three-phase system other than solidly grounded Ys. Okay, so Ys you typically would perfectly fine to use slash ratings or whatnot. It's not a problem. It says other than solidly grounded Ys, particularly on corner grounded delta systems, consider the circuit breaker's individual pole interruptive capability. So again, looking at that breaker, making sure that you're selecting the right breaker. And of course, it reminded us again if you're dealing with those, would typically probably be a straight rated, is to determine whether or not you're using it on a 3-phase application that it has that denotion on there. Okay, so hopefully that answers your question. No, you just can't grab any breaker just because it fits. If it's a 120 240 volt, then that's what we're gonna use for that application. If it's a 277 480 volt, that's what we're gonna use for that application, right? But just remember the slash rating, the lower side is in an installation where the values of the circuit breaker's rating is not going to exceed the nominal voltage to ground for the low side. And then the high side of that slash, or the right side of that slash rating, is not going to exceed the nominal voltage between any two conductors, okay, that it's connected to. Okay? All right. Hopefully that answers that question in a little more detail, because, again, that's the difference between a straight versus the slash. Now, the key to remember this one is anytime you have the slash, you do need to worry about the lower value first, because I don't want to use one that's a 120 on to ground when I could have a circuit that's actually 277 to ground. And that would be a problem, especially if you just go grabbing a breaker. Okay? Just be careful of that. Okay, so let's see here if we got one more that we can try to throw into today's episode. Let's see here. Hey, Paul, love your podcast. Well, you're welcome. Says, I have a question. Is it true in the 2020 National Electrical Code we are now required to put surge protective devices on our 1 and 2 family dwellings? Again, love the podcast. Look forward to the answer. Okay, great question. Thanks for submitting it. You probably have gone through a continuing education class at some point, and they have, added this information, and you're kind of bumbling on it. And you're thinking, well, do I have to have surge protective devices? Okay, so a couple things first. If you're just migrating to the 2020 edition of the NEC, then you probably remember that surge protective devices and surge arresters and all this type of stuff used to be in 280 and 285. Now it's been moved and it's in 242. So that gives you the information about the different types of SPDs and things like that. But when it comes to this rule, this is obviously you're talking about a service. This rule was added in Article 230, and it was added during the 2020 cycle and is located at Section 67 of Article 230, and it says surge protection. And you've got an A, B, C, and D here. You have to follow each one of them. And this is an example of a retroactive type of rule. If you go in and, for example, the service equipment is replaced at some point, then you're going to apply this rule. Okay? So we'll look at it so they can kind of break it down for you. At any time you don't understand the difference between a type 1, a type 2, type 3 type of surge protective devices, and I encourage you to go look at Article 242. You're not going to see that, folks, in your 2017. You're going to end up having to go and look at the 280 and 285 when you're dealing with surge protective devices, and then lightning arresters if you're dealing with that application. But now it's all in 242 of the 2020. Okay, so again, my lesson is assuming you're using the 2020, so we're going to go with that. So 230.67 says this. There's an A, B, C, and a D. Let's look at each one of them real quickly. Now, A says surge protective devices. It says all services supplying dwelling units shall be provided with surge protective devices. Okay? So, hey, you know what? This sounds exactly like it sounds. All service, okay? Services supplying it. This rule. Okay? So this applies to services. Very distinctive. Services that are supplying dwelling units. Okay? It says all services supplying dwelling units shall be provided with the surge protective SPD. Next, it's telling me the location of this surge protection. It says the surge protecting device shall be an integral part of the service equipment or shall be located immediately adjacent thereto. Okay, so integral part. Many manufacturers who obviously make panel boards, load centers, like an Eaton, Schneider, all of those, they actually make surge protective devices as well. It's part of their portfolio. And in many cases, they incorporate it into the actual load center, whether it's a separate module at the bottom, whether it's a circuit breaker that clips onto the bus, or they make these things. So that would be an integral part. Immediately adjacent, again, can run into speculation. People want a definition of immediately adjacent or where it means. But to me, immediately adjacent means right beside it. That's just the way I interpret it. You can get into the semantics all you want and say, well, I think immediate is 10 feet down the line. Well, whatever. That to me, it's not very immediate. So as an AHJ, we had to come up with a way to enforce this type of language the best way we could so that we could universally make sure everybody was on the same page. So I used to tell people, look, immediately adjacent to me was within arm's reach. And that's the best way we'd do it. And again, that's speculative as well because everybody's arm's reach is different. But I like it to be as close as I can right next to it. So because the deal is you want those conductors from the surge protective device to the breaker in the bus. If you're doing one immediately adjacent, you want them to be as short as possible. You do. The less bends you have, the short as possible. It doesn't create inductive chokes, and it allows the surge protective device to do what it's. So the longer you go, you could have more issues with it. But with that said, we had to come up with uniformity of what immediately adjacent means. So I just used within arm's reach, but again, your jurisdiction can do what you want. Most people say, don't want it right beside it, intimate, touching it, or whatever. That's up to you. There is an exception. An exception leads into allowing certain distances. Okay, so my length issue gets blown out of the water when you look at the exception. Okay, my theory of keeping it short, and that's what they say in the literature. But then you've got this exception, and here's what the exception says. Now, this is the exception to the location. So if you're listening, this is exception to having to be integral part or immediately adjacent. It says, the SPD shall not be required to be located in the service equipment as required in B if located at each next level distribution equipment downstream towards the load. So at each of your remote distribution panels downstream, then you could have your SPD located, okay? So it does give you the exception for this, but it basically tells me at each next level, okay, for the loads. So that's your allowance to that. So this is basically allowing you, let's say you have your service disconnect outside, right? And 230.85 for 1 and 2 family requires that to be an exterior service disconnecting means, which is also could serve as your emergency disconnect. Of course, you could have the emergency disconnect outside and still not be feeders. They'd still be service conductors. And then, of course, then it comes in and hits your main breaker inside because the code says what? Your service disconnect means can be outside or inside nearest point of entry. So depending on how you design your system, if it was outside and it was exterior panel and it was serving double duty as the service disconnecting means as well as the emergency disconnect, and you were meeting 230.85 and all that good stuff, if that was one of your options, then what you've got is you're going, okay, well, if that's the case, this would allow me to put that SPD at the remote panel inside the dwelling, right? Downstream. Okay? Would be okay. That's what this rule is allowing you to do. Okay, just to kind of keep it simple the way we would understand it. It's still going to require the SPD. It's just giving you a little flexibility to the location. Now, C talks about which types of SPDs. Okay, well, this tells me that it can be type 1 or type 2 SPD. Now, again, as I've told you, if you're not understanding what the difference in the two are, then I encourage you to go to Article 242. All right. And that is going to give you some information on the different types. So part 2 is dealing with the surge protective devices, which is 1,000 volts or less, which is what we're dealing with. And of course, part 3 is the surge arresters where they're over 1,000 volts. Again, all this was covered in 280 and 285 in the previous edition. 2020, it just brought it all together. And you'll notice that it pretty much regurgitated the information from those other articles here into one convenient location 242 makes sense because 240 is overcurrent. So 242 was a placeholder, perfectly fine for overvoltage because that's what we're talking about, an overvoltage condition. So we're in part 2. And if you look in part 2, you're going to see it does give an explanation of type 1 SPDs, type 2 SPDs, and it kind of gives you all of those scenarios involved in it. And it tells you where they can be located. So for example, type 1 installation, it says type 1 SPDs shall be permitted to be connected in accordance with one of the following. Number 1, to the supply side of the service disconnect as permitted in 230.82.4, which is that list of things that can be on the supply side, as specified in 242.14, which means that is going to be on the load side typically. So you can have a type 1 SPD on the line side or even the load side. Just make sure you check with the provider, the SPD provider, whoever they are, to make sure how it's listed and whatnot. But that's what it gives you, those rules, okay? So then it goes on to tell us at the service, we're installed at the service, type 1 SPD shall be connected to one of the following, gives you the locations where it can be connected, okay? And then, of course, the type 2 says a service supplying a building or structure. It says type 2 shall be connected anywhere on the load side of a service disconnect overcurrent device required by 230.91 unless installed in accordance with 230.82.8. So you'll get some allowances there for the applications and when you might use it. All right. So then you got B, which is a feeder supplying a building or structure. Type 2 SPD shall be connected at the building or structure anywhere on the load side of the first overcurrent device at the building or the structure. So it's just telling you where these have to be. The rule that we're focused on is 230.67. And that is basically saying, the only reason I went to 242 was to kind of give you an explanation of the different types. But to answer this question, we're still going to stay very much in section 67 of Article 230. So we've established the location. We've established the type. So it's type 1 or type 2, depending on where we're making that connection. And the last one is D. And D is a replacement rule. And here's what it says. It says where, and this answers your question directly, it says where service equipment is replaced, all of the requirements of this section shall apply. Now, I'm going to tell you my opinion is the term where service equipment is replaced is a strong term because there's certain things that you can do and you're not replacing it, right? And so that's a decision that the HA is going to make determining whether or not that's considered replacement of service equipment, those type of things. If you're going in and there's something happens and a service person's coming in and fixing something in the main panel, but it's not being replaced, then it wouldn't invoke this. And so an inspector couldn't come in and say, well, I need you to put SPD on it. Well, I didn't replace it. It's the same service. So again, that's going to be up to the AHJ and they make that determination. Now, I believe, and don't hold me to this because I don't want to load it up right now, but I believe that this might be changing into 2023. And of course, if it does, you're going to hear us do update courses here in the future. We're going to do some podcasts about things that are changed since now the NITMAM is completed. But we're not going to do anything until we know that everything is final. Then we'll start letting you know about the different changes. But it might be a situation where this changes and broadens and not just a replacement. But we'll keep you posted on that. Right now, under 2020, if you do service equipment replacement, then you're going to have to require the SPD to be installed. If it's a new installation, then you're already going to be required for it to be installed. Okay? So hopefully that answers your question. Yes, new installations, 1 and 2 family, I shouldn't say 1 and 2 family. Again, words are important. It says all service supplying dwelling units, which would apply to services that supply 1 family dwellings, services that apply each individual dwelling unit of a 2 family. You could have an allowance in 230.40 under the exceptions that a multifamily building is supplied, each unit is supplied by a service. If that's the case, then those individual dwelling units, then this rule would apply because those are dwelling units, even though it's a multifamily building. Okay? It's a lot of stuff to think about. But again, you're absolutely 100% right. You're going to need to think about surge protection now. And it's covered in Article 230 under 67. And hopefully that answers that question. All right, folks. Hopefully that's answered your questions. If you have anything else, remember what you can do. You can always run over to our portal at paulabernathy.com, and we are more than happy to try to answer your questions the best we can. You can agree to disagree with them. That's totally up to you, but we'll do our best. Till next time, folks, stay safe. God bless.